Hello and welcome to the 12th episode of the Team Improvefitness podcast. Today we have a special guest. I have followed him for some time and subscribed to his member site and learned a lot about hormones and how to use them in a safer way. So without further ado, we are very happy to welcome Victor Black to our podcast. Hello, Victor. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come onto the show, guys. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Maybe you can introduce yourself to the audience, Victor. We are really happy that you are here, but I think not a lot of people in Germany knows you. So maybe you can introduce yourself and tell us what is your message.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think very few people listening are probably aware of who I am. I think it's fair to say over the last perhaps 5 years, my profile in countries like the UK and America and Australia has been slowly growing, getting traction. But I think it's fair to say that Europe is probably the area of the world that I have the least traction, the least profile. So I'm not in any way sort of concerned about people knowing me or not knowing me. Hopefully, by the time we get to the end of the podcast, people will go, okay, so this is a voice that I can add to my follow list, someone to listen to in the future. So a little bit about myself. So I'm in my mid-50s. I'm a very passionate amateur bodybuilding. We're talking just before the show started. In 2019, I competed in the over 50s Mr. Universe Masterclass. My intention was to compete in 2020, but like many people with the COVID shutdown around the world, that kind of got put on hold. So I haven't competed in the last 12-month, 18-month time frame, but fully intend to go back to the stage. I've been on the stage for 27 years, so very passionate about that. But I also am probably well known as what is generally referred to as an evidence-based trainer with a focus on enhancement practices. So the interesting thing about myself is for 20 years, I trained and competed as a natural bodybuilder, okay? But when I opened the door into enhanced, I decided to make it my great passion to do it in the safest possible manner. I don't like the word safe. I think it's disingenuous and irresponsible to use the word safe when we're talking about endocrine system modulation. But I honestly started, like most people, very much as the bro and made an awful lot of mistakes. And I just, at some point, just got frustrated with the lack of quality information that seemed to be available for people, and decided to bury myself, to immerse myself in the clinical literature, the sports science, the applied science that's available in this domain. And I've spent the last 15 years, waist deep in that. But it's still at the same time, I very much consider myself to be a practitioner, the voice of experience. So I have very squarely one foot in the evidence-based training camp and one foot in the practical day-to-day application as a recreational amateur competitor.
So really nice. You say you have your you are really into the research, because a lot of people, I think, don't understand that we have these drugs that are normally produced for therapy. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of studies in humans that show us how these drugs can work. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good thing that you really go into the research and then you give your recommendations, right?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the great ironies about our tribe is that many people don't realize that testosterone, specifically we're talking about testosterone here, insulin and growth hormone, which are probably the three, I guess, primary compound classifications that we would hear about people discussing. So testosterone, its derivatives, anabolic and androgenic steroids, recombinant human growth hormone, and of course, there are many pathways that we potentially might modulate that. But if we just talk about recombinant human growth hormone and insulin, are probably some of the most studied drugs in all pharmacology. There would be perhaps 50,000 studies that are available through, the medical databases like PubMed and others on the subject of testosterone. Now, obviously, the overwhelming majority of those studies relate to the application of testosterone for hormone replacement therapy for men that are effectively what they call hypergonadal. They're not able to produce testosterone at adequate levels themselves. But, a surprisingly large amount of literature is still available on what we would call more than that. Okay. So there's two groups there. One is They did a lot of study on testosterone as a male contraceptive in the 80s and 90s, and some of the doses they looked at there were, a little surprising to people. And of course, then, we're going to be talking principally about female use today. So you have to understand then that really since about the 1950s, 1960s timeframe, there's been an attempt by the pharmaceutical industry to take the testosterone molecule and realize its therapeutic benefits, but to modify that molecule rather in such a way that we can apply it to the androgen sensitive, so women and the elderly. So we realize the therapeutic benefits, but without the potential damaging androgenic or virilization component of testosterone. And there's a tremendous amount of clinical literature, if you wish to embrace in that field, far more than most people I think are aware.
Yeah. I have a question regarding that topic. So if we look at the literature, the population, in most studies, they're never athletes. So they're just people who have a specific population character.
Yep.
Maybe we say, okay, males from the age as of, let's say 50, but they probably never have the training aspect. So do you think that there is a shortcoming in our conclusions that we can draw from those studies if we have a population that is actually not what we are?
Not only would I agree with that, but I would extend that and say I believe that's true of all applied science studies, even in natural individuals. Yeah. So if you look at the clinical literature that we have available to draw our opinions on about training practices and nutritional practices, most of that literature is either in effectively untrained college students that are being utilized for study purposes because they're cheap and easy to access, or they're elderly people in nursing homes. There are actually very, very few studies on athletes and what I would call well-trained athletes in even natural training studies. So one of the great frustrations, and as I said, I spent 20 years training as a natural, I look a lot of applied science studies for natural athletes and go, yeah, but that doesn't apply to natural, people who've been training for 15 or 20 years. Yes, that is, very plausibly true. And the evidence that we have clearly demonstrates that set of circumstances may well be true for effectively untrained individuals. Okay. But give me that athlete and give me 10 years of training age, and let's redo that study. And we may well find out very, very different outcomes are applied because of the training age that, it just changes things. So not only do I agree with that statement, I would extend that further and say that's pretty much a blanket statement that you can apply to all applied science studies, from training to nutrition to supplementation and yes, absolutely. In terms of enhancement, there's a common thread that runs through across all of that. Yeah.
So our next question is, can you explain us your view on the safer use model? Especially so maybe in general, and then especially later for the women's.
Yeah, I think what we should do is maybe focus in on the women's point of view, but I will briefly touch on the differences between men and women. Okay, so women are typically so exquisitely sensitive to growth promotion agents. In other words, their response to stimulus inputs, is so profound that a great many of the historical problems that we have in male populations simply don't exist in women. So if we look at a man, you would say, okay, historically in the 1970s, our focus used to be on things like gynecomastia and liver stress, so hepatotoxicity. People were obsessed about hair loss and all these sorts of things. But today in 2021, I think it's fair to say we've moved on from these relatively, I'm not dismissing them, but they're very well understood and relatively easy to address issues. And now we're dealing with the concerns about the impact on cardiac remodeling, physical structural change to the heart consequential to these drugs, the impact that these drugs have on renal function, on damaging your kidneys, and the impact that they have. One of my great passions now is the impact they have on cognitive function on the brain. Now, the reason that that's a problem for men is because the dosages of these drugs that men typically use are many, many, many times greater than women, typically. Yeah. Now, what's interesting about women is, so if you take that too casually, you could kind of say, okay, so we don't have any problems as women because we're not using as much. But I would argue that women are simply faced with a completely different set of problems. The problems that women are faced with fundamentally revolve around the risk towards what we call androgenic outcomes. So in other words, if you expose yourself to androgens, and what I mean by androgens is either testosterone or one of the testosterone derivatives that we collectively refer to as anabolic steroids, then there is a risk that you're going to introduce what we call male secondary sexual characteristics. And they would be defined like things by changes to the voice, lowering the voice, issues like hair growth in unwanted areas, particularly the face and these sorts of things, and even changes to sexual anatomy. Now, one of the great problems is those changes happen at dosages in women that are not large enough in magnitude to cause major health problems, okay? So it's sometimes uncomfortable talking about these things, but we need to be adults and talk about these things. There is a cohort of individuals that are really interesting to look at, which is the transgender community. What that means is, so these are people that are born as women, okay, but they wish to be identified as men, okay? So they are effectively going through a process under the support of their medical providers, endocrinologists and such like that, of trying to deliberately and intentionally induce these outcomes. They want to sound more masculine. They want to have a more masculine appearance. And we know that the doses that we need to give this cohort of individuals don't really cause problems to the heart, to the liver, to the kidneys, to the brain. Those dosages are typically extremely well tolerated by those individuals, and we have pretty good clinical literature to support that. So in other words, you can get to a situation where you have a woman where you have the worst possible outcome, like in terms of like, oh my God, I wasn't seeking that outcome, and here it is. I sound like a man and I look like a man for all intents and purposes, but I have not in that process effectively created cardiac risk or, renal function risk or, liver risk. We know that because there is a group of women, for want of a better word, deliberately and intentionally trying to induce those outcomes. And they're effectively able to do that in a relatively safe way, with the singular exception is they're realizing those outcomes that we want to avoid in women. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Yes.
Yep. So it's a completely different class of problems for women. We have to separate the discussion from men away from women and say, look, we need to sit down and we need to have different discussions of different concern right from the get-go one of my great laments is, unfortunately, women very often in this industry are treated like little men, and you cannot approach it from that point of view. Yeah,
I had a client, she's from Thailand. And she told me that before she comes to me to the coachings, someone told her, or some coaches told her, take test prop and Testosterone, and she's not competing. And I have the feeling what you said, that a lot of coaches, a lot of men treat the woman like a little man, and that's the problem. It's because we have the virilization effect, and like you said, this can happen with low dosage.
Yeah. So let me just, I do like to interrupt, sorry, when people say things, because I want this, I see these opportunities as chances for us to create historical content here that people can look back on in years and reference this. I think it's incredibly valuable. So let me just clarify a couple of things there. There's no problem with using testosterone and masteron in women, right? The dose is the discussion. So for example, if you understand the evolution of anabolic steroids, pretty much every steroid we have was derived from the testosterone molecule very specifically to try to meet the needs of women, okay? And that includes masteron. Even the word masteron, the actual name of the drug is drostanolone propionate or drostanolone enanthate, depending on the ester. But the trade name masteron literally is derived from the Latin word mast, meaning breast. And so in other words, this drug was historically deployed in women for the treatment of estrogen-mediated breast cancer. That drug was developed for women, right? So this idea that, oh my God, women shouldn't use masteron, I'm going, hang on a sec. If you understand this, any drug that has historically been successfully deployed in women and has been well tolerated by that cohort without virilization consequences is on the table for discussion here, right? There is no drug that cannot be discussed as long as you got that drug was deployed in women for this many years, very successfully, produced a therapeutic beneficial outcome with minimal virilization outcomes. We can talk about the drug as a potential, enhancement agent, including the drug Trenbolone. When Trenbolone was in human clinical use, one of its indications was osteoporosis. So it's very likely someone's grandmother in the 80s was getting Trenbolone to treat her for basically bone wasting disease. So any drug that falls into that category has historically or is currently deployed in the female and is well tolerated, we can discuss. So just to clarify that point, there's no problem with testosterone. I would argue that testosterone is one of the safest drugs for women to use, and we'll get into why that is. But the dose is the poison. So the amount of testosterone that you would deliver to a man versus the amount of testosterone you would give to a woman, even in therapeutic practice. So if we look at HRT practices, where there are women who are basically going to menopause and their postmenopausal state, it's not uncommon today for women to be given testosterone as part of a hormone replacement therapy practice, right? But the doses they're given to realize, what we would call normal range testosterone are staggeringly low. To give you an example, most men, when they talk about testosterone replacement therapy today, are talking about somewhere between 100 and 200 milligrams of testosterone a week. So testosterone replacement therapy for a postmenopausal woman begins at 3 milligrams a week. So it's like, holy crap, most people think like, I thought it was going to be 20 or something like that. It's a very, very small amount by comparison to male use. Sorry, now, Nicole, you were about to answer a question a few minutes ago and I cut you off. I just want to go back.
It's really interesting what you said, because I think some months ago, I thought the same thing, that Testosterone and Tren and testosterone is not supposed to take from women.
Yeah.
And this client, she gets recommended 100 milligrams. I thought a week, that's too much.
Of how much testosterone?
Testosterone propionate.
Yeah. That's a lot too much.
That's too much.
Just to give you,
no, don't take any.
Yeah, just to give you a reference point there. So, was talking before about this cohort of individuals that are born as women and they wish to identify as men. We call them the transgender community. So the therapeutic process of going down that road, for want of a better word, saying, look, I want to identify as a man. I want to walk down the street and people hopefully recognize me as male, right? That process begins at 50 milligrams a week. So transgender individuals are able to realize that outcome at 50 milligrams a week. So 100 milligrams a week, you're in transgender territory. That's where you're headed. Yeah,
that's the problem, because the dosage of 3 milligrams a week, it's super difficult to administer.
It is and it isn't. The reason it's difficult is because, again, like, people don't understand that the needs of women are just massively different to the needs of men. So if you were to take a typical testosterone supply from either a pharmaceutical grade product or an underground laboratory product, typical concentrations are in the vicinity of 200 to 250 milligrams per milliliter or 250 milligrams per cc. This is typical, right? So trying to draw 3 milligrams from that is like, that's impossible. But there are underground laboratories that I've been working with now that, I'm talking to them. They're starting to make products specifically for women. There is a product, for example, in the market now, which is 7 milligrams per cc. So if you would, I don't know whether you've ever seen a cc drawn out, you draw out the whole cc, this is only 7 milligrams. This is the type of volume concentration that women need to use these products in a structured and correct manner. Yeah. Trying to draw 3 milligrams a week from a 250 milligrams per cc vial that's just not going to happen. Yeah,
that's the main problem.
Maybe this is also one of the reasons why it would never be administered by coaches in those small dosages, because the problem starts at administering such small dosages.
Yeah.
So why would even
I think the problem is, if we're really honest, the problem, there's many shortcomings to the model. No one individual is to blame. In my opinion, the coaches are to blame. In my opinion, the educators of coaches are to be blamed. If you appreciate, realistically, there should be a methodology in place to educate the coaches. And part of what I'm doing, you see my logo up there, I'm on the 1st of June, I'm opening a new facility called Prep Coach Academy. The entire purpose is to try and help coaches learn. So are coaches responsible? Yes. But I would even argue that medical healthcare providers, are culpable here as well. Everybody has to wear some blame here. Every single person, from the UGO people that don't make the products in the formats that women need, to the doctors that are unable to support athletes, to the coaches, and to be honest with you, all the way down the line to the athletes themselves. The reason I'm in this position, it's not like someone spoon-fed me. I decided to roll up my sleeve as a user and educate myself. And most of my peers that I interact with, that I have a deal of respect for, and they know what they're doing, they're self-educated. Today, there is nowhere you go to learn about this. So everybody's in the same boat. Like, it's all well and good to say, well, I don't know where to learn. Like, the fuck do you think I learned from? I taught myself. So I would argue that every single link in the chain, all the way down the chain, all the way right down to the suppliers, everybody needs to basically take some responsibility for the fact that women, their needs are not really understood, nor are they serviced, in what I would call a manner that reflects the usage that we see in our tribe. We're talking about, I'm not joking when I say millions of men today use PEDs, and it's fair to say not as many women as that, but we're still talking about, a very sizable, number of individual women who are using some type of enhancement product at some level. And given the size of the market, the quality of the education, the quality of the information that's available is very poor.
I know maybe a handful of people that I can say, okay, they have really knowledge about this topic. Chester Rockwell, maybe you know him.
Yeah, I know Chester,
Broderick Chavez, and Scott Havel.
Yep, one of my favorites, Scott.
Yeah, he's a genius. Yeah. And maybe I listened to Joe Jeffrey's recommendations. I find them, they're really good, but it's really difficult for a normal athlete or normal trainee to find the right informations. It's really difficult because in Germany, if I go to the forums and search for something, you just 99% are BS.
Yeah, if I'm really honest, this is why I said to you, even the educators need to see. So for example, there's certain landmark points in my career that I reflect back on, and I can equate. Okay, so that happened, and then that caused me to turn this corner. I vividly remember looking at reference materials that have been held up as the Bible in this industry for decades now. Particularly, I'm very transparent about it. There's a gentleman by the name of Bill Llewellyn who has a book, an Anabolic Standard Handbook, but that has, I think it's version 13 or something now. It's like a mainstay. One of the reasons I ended up going to this path is, I started reading things going, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound right. And I started, researching myself, and very quickly came to understand that, I've got to be honest with you, a lot of that information in that book is just not right. It's wrong.
Can you make a example?
Sure. So if we were talking about the drug Trenbolone before, most people in our community, we're really kind of coming out the domain of talking to female use now, but just since you asked the question, most people would say, look, Trenbolone is the strongest drug that we have. It has an androgenic to anabolic ratio of 500 to 500. You might have heard that quoted before. It's 5 times more androgenic than testosterone is. It's 5 times more anabolic. Now, where did they get that from that book? It's printed in black and white. If you've got a copy of the book, open the book up to Trenbolone, look down to the myotropic androgenic anabolic ratio, and it literally says 500 to 500. Now, of course, in reality, Trenbolone is a steroidal SARMs. That means it is far less androgenic than testosterone is, far less. And, if you just need some anecdotal observation, you have to say, so if you understand how Trenbolone was deployed in human clinical use, it was given to the androgen sensitive. So in other words, one of the indications for use was for osteoporosis and malnutrition. These were 2 of the indications for use. And when you think about it, you're going, why the hell would they give women who are suffering from osteoporosis a drug that is 5 times more androgenic testosterone? That doesn't make any sense. Surely they would have given them one of these drugs that's derived from testosterone, that the point of the drug is to maintain the therapeutic benefits of testosterone, but minimize the androgenic impact. Surely they would have done that, right? And they did, because Trenbolone does not have an androgenic anabolic ratio of 5 times. So we have an entire tribe that's walking around with a mindset that says, Trenbolone is one of the strongest drugs there is out there. And because of that mindset, it is massively abused by our community. In reality, if you understand what the drug is, it's actually what we call a steroidal SARMs. So it's less androgenic than testosterone, and it has an anabolic potential that is fundamentally equated to all of the other anabolic steroids. There's no evidence in human beings, right, that any particular drug you're able to take and get 5 times the anabolic potential from. So you understand, like if you took 200 milligrams of Trenbolone as a male and you took 200 milligrams of testosterone, you don't grow 5 times faster. It doesn't work that way, do you know what I mean? But people still think that because Bill told the world that for many, many years. He's just wrong, do you know what I mean? And again, if you have a copy of the book, open the book up and then go to PubMed and type in Trenbolone steroidal SARMs and start reading. Okay, so
that's interesting. I heard a lot of these things, like the androgenicity from some steroids, for example, that I don't know, primobolan. That is not so. That is more androgenic, but in reality, I think it's not so androgenic.
Primobolan is the least androgenic compound that we have.
Less than
the most female-friendly drug that basically exists in that class of drugs. How do we know this? So when the drug was in female clinical use, one of the ways that we can tell this is this. When they trialed the drugs in humans, what did we see? Okay. And when it was in human clinical use, what did we see? Why? Because these are studies that are undertaken with with a certain control set. So here's a control group. So this group are given a placebo and this group are not. And we have doctors and people who are trained in observation to make assessments. So when Masteron was given to women as a breast cancer treatment, it was given to women at between 100 and 300 milligrams a week. That's like an eye-watering dose. You think, holy crap, like, wow, that's a lot. You have to understand the largest human use trial that was ever undertaken in anabolic steroid was 1,200 milligrams a week of primobolan given to women. Like, why would you give a drug that's so androgenic to women at that dose? That just doesn't make any sense. And what they were trying to ascertain was the clinical effectiveness of primobolan against, what was the gold standard of the day, which was testosterone propionate, to understand what was its clinical effect versus its masculinization or virilization effect. So we would say, in order, primobolan, Masteron, probably Nandrolone, and then you kind of start coming down the list in terms of that. So when we compared like Nandrolone, a lot of women, think that Nandrolone is less androgenic, but the reality is that we have head-to-head trials where they gave this group of women Nandrolone and they give this group of women Masteron for this many weeks, and they looked at the outcomes, and this many people experienced virilization effects on Nandrolone and this many people experienced virilization effects on Masteron. And the reality is that Nandrolone actually performed just by a small margin better than Masteron in treating the disease state. But basically, Masteron caused such a profound degree less virilization than Nandrolone that was selected as the drug of choice for that treatment. So not quite as clinically effective, right? But the difference in virilization was so profound that the medical community said, right, we're using Masteron for this purpose. And again, most people would think that Masteron is a potent androgenic compound by comparison to something like Nandrolone. It's just not supported in clinical literature or in clinical practice. And I said the reason behind that is they don't give women, Nandrolone at that dose, but they certainly give women Masteron at that dose, or they did historically. Clearly, it's not currently in human use. And the principal reason behind that is today's generation of what we call SERMs, tamoxifen and aromatase inhibitors, have basically displaced Masteron as the estrogen-mediated breast cancer treatment of today.
So if you make a comparison between really popular PED for women, a lot of coaches use them, even in the bikini divisions, is oxandrolone, so Anavar. And you say primobolan is better, safer.
So maybe I can outline what I would give people as a general framework to try and go away and learn a little bit more about this. Yeah. So I would argue in 2021, we have a long list of potential drug candidates that we might consider. It's not 1975 anymore. There's lots of things that we could do. Yeah. And the easiest thing to start the discussion rolling with women is to understand this. Some of those drugs you need to view through the lens of saying they're androgens. They ultimately, regardless of how much you give a woman, if you give it to her for a long enough period of time, are going to cause androgenic impact. Okay. Even really small doses of these drugs, as little as 2 milligrams of Winstrol a day, if you give it to a woman for long enough, you see consequence, right? There are trials on nandrolone at 50 milligrams a month. Now, if you gave 50 milligrams of nandrolone to a woman for a month, nothing's going to happen. But give her 50 milligrams a month for 12 months and you start to see changes to her voice. You see what I'm saying? It's not just about the peak concentration of the drug. It's the cumulative exposure that you're giving to that individual. Yeah. And not just over a cycle, but over a lifetime. Okay. So the first pass framework begins like this. Understand, here's a long list of things that we might consider as drugs. That would include things like recombinant human growth hormone, clambuterol, insulin, testosterone, its derivatives. There's a long list of things that we might consider enhancement tools. Some of those drugs come with the risk of virilization and some do not. Now, that does not for 1 second mean that those that fit into the do not category are safe to use. It means they have problems of their own. They just don't happen to have those problems. You know? So an example is something like recombinant human growth hormone. You cannot virilize a woman with that drug. It's not an androgen. You understand what I mean? Yeah. So you could basically say, look, I could safely give a woman a unit of growth hormone a day for the rest of her life, and she will not take one step further towards virilization than she is today. You know, if you gave a woman even as little as 2 milligrams of Winstrol every day for the rest of her life, she's on that journey. You see the difference between those two classes of drugs? It's very important that people understand. I'm not saying there's not problems with recombinant human growth hormone. I'm saying not that problem. So the logical framework says, right, when you're a woman, you try to exhaust all of the drugs that you might potentially use that don't come with that consequence of use first, right? And when you've exhausted that list of drugs, the very last drug that you put on the table is the class of drugs that we will refer to as androgens or anabolic steroids. I'm not saying you don't use them, but you hold them till the end, okay? And you say, okay, so we're going to use these in the most strategic way possible. I'll give you a simple example. If someone said to me, how do I feel about a woman using, say, 10 milligrams or even 20 milligrams of Anavar a day for an 8-week cycle? And I said to her, okay, so she's going to do 8 weeks, and at the end of 8 weeks, she's going to stop and she's never going to touch Anavar again for her life. Have at it. I don't have any problem with that at all. The problem is, so what are you going to do for the other 300 days of the year? What are you going to do for the other 9 years of your career? So you see the problem with that first, when the first line of drug is an androgen, the first question you say, well, I can only do that for a certain limited time. And then I either use nothing, okay, or, and potentially, and I have to work out a better strategy. My strategy is we want to put something in place that allows women to basically be super, women, as it were, a range of tools that can modulate metabolic pathways, performance outcomes, but not expose her to the risk of virilization, okay? And for some women, you never have to go further than that, depending on what her goals are, depending on how her genetic response is. And for some women, they will choose to put that last, card on the table, yeah? Sometimes strategically, yeah?
So your strategy is?
Go ahead, sorry.
Your strategy is not to use first-line androgenic drugs, but as a first-line treatment, it would be those drugs.
So for a man, the very first drug that you would wheel out, you would basically take testosterone, okay? And you would introduce testosterone at a moderate dose. Typically, we would start at what we call a clinical dose, like 2 milligrams per kilogram, and you would gradually titrate that testosterone drug up. That's the first line of action. The only logical, rational thing to do for a man would be to slowly raise his testosterone levels outside of super physiological range. The completely opposite is true for women. You would leave androgens till the very last drug that you used. And this is why we get into so much trouble, because many of the coaches are simply following what is a very, very valid model for men, and they're trying to apply it to people that have just a completely different physiology. Yeah. So yeah, if you simply look at that first pass and said, what would be the first drug that you would introduce to a man? I would say testosterone at clinical dose and titrate so that you then push them outside of physiological range. That would be the last thing you do for a woman.
And what would be the first thing you would do for a woman then?
So
human.
cycle design is always needs-based. First, you have to tell me who you are, where you come from, where you're at, your training age, what are your goals, etc. Are you looking at fat loss? Are you looking at hypertrophy? Are you a power lifter looking for central nervous system, activation? So in other words, all cycle design should be needs-based, which means that I need to sit down with you and understand who you are, where you've come from, where you're going, and what you're trying to achieve. Let's say, though, however, let's just put an example on the table just to make it practical for people, right? If we had someone that said, look, I'm interested in, maybe improving my body composition. Okay. So I want to lose a little fat. Ideally, I want to, gain a little muscle sort of thing. And I'm a serious recreational trainer. I mean, a drug like Clambuterol would make one of the choices that made that table. Why? Because it's not that there isn't problems with Clambuterol. There's a long list of problems that we can associate with Clambuterol, but masculinization is not one of them. Okay, so exposure to Clambuterol, we have to have a discussion. So what is the risk profile? What is the dose response? What are the, we always say the dose is the poison, as it were. You can have some individuals that don't tolerate the drug well. You can have some individuals that love the drug well. There's a degree of intra-individual genetic response. But let's just say we had a circumstances where we had an individual that fit that profile. We go, well, let's wheel out something like Clambuterol. It's a tool that is both a fat loss agent, a pharmacological fat loss agent, but it also is a hypertrophic agent in its own right. Now, it's not powerful enough as a hypertrophic agent to be of real merit to men, okay? But women being so exquisitely sensitive to growth promoters, I've seen women that just take a little bit of Clambuterol and they respond very well in terms of improvements in body composition, and they haven't exposed themselves to any virilization risk at all. We just need to now talk about, so what did they expose themselves to? Surely there has to be an ugly to that drug, and of course there is, but it's not virilization. I keep kind of going around in that, that caught in that trap sort of thing. So I would say, let's say things like, well, you do realize that growth hormone doesn't do that. Clambuterol doesn't do that. We might talk about a myostatin inhibitor. You understand what the premise of what myostatin is, where, there is a protein hormone that basically the body produces to stop runaway hypertrophic growth. It's called myostatin. It's one of the 8 metabolic pathways that you can modulate for hypertrophic effect. It's, one of the holy grails that everybody in the research community is chasing, principally because it doesn't work via the androgen receptor. By inhibiting myostatin, basically what happens is you see an improvement in body composition, improvement in lean body mass, but not via the androgen receptor, so you don't have that problem. So one of the things that recombinant human growth hormone does is it's a myostatin inhibitor. There's many different pathways that it does. There's many ways that it contributes to hypertrophy, but as a myostatin inhibitor, you're effectively seeing an improvement in body composition without any potential risk of virilization through that pathway.
Really interesting. So, it's just difficult to, because it's costly to have human growth hormone.
So yeah, let me just cover that, because I completely. So one of the reasons that drugs like Anavar are so popular, you have to ask, why the hell is it so popular, right? You have to understand, well, Anavar by comparison to growth hormone is dirt cheap. It's not the least expensive steroid there is, but it is very inexpensive compared to, say, growth hormone, okay? And it's an oral administration pathway, which is very attractive to many people. A lot of people have needle phobia sort of thing. So this is what I'm saying. You have to really, when you look at drugs, you have to view things through a filter. It's not as simple as good or bad. You have to understand an individual's needs. What can they access? What can they afford? Do they have any sort of, I'll give an example. I'm a huge fan of the use of insulin, and I don't mean in large quantities. I just mean a very small amount, right? Why? Because as a man, right, there are 8 metabolic pathways that I could modulate. What most people do is simply take out a 20-pound sledgehammer and smash as hard as they can on the androgen receptor with steroids. I would prefer to modulate as many of those pathways as I can moderately, so I can minimize my risk and my stress profile. And in my opinion, a very small amount of steroids, a very small amount of growth hormone, and a very small amount of insulin, and a very small amount of this, and a very small amount is a far, far, far safer model than abuse of any one single drug, chasing one single pathway. Now, some people are just going to say, look, I have this thing about insulin I've heard so many bad stories about over the year. I'm just not comfortable doing it. Great, let's just take that off the table. So this is where coaches need to be able to sit down and understand the needs of their clients and be able to offer them a range of solutions which are flexible enough to take into account client personal preference. So the trilogy of evidence-based practice is, okay, so what can we learn from observation and experience? This is what I've spent 35 years training. This is my experience. What can we learn from the clinical literature? And this is where I'm wasting that. And then we have to marry that alongside the client's personal choice and preferences. So if I was talking to a woman, she said, look, I can't really back it up. I've just heard so many bad stories about insulin. I really just don't want to go there. Great, let's just not go there. That's not the difference between success or failure. It is, however, a drug that does offer certain athletes certain benefits, principally under the fuel supply efficiency banner, right? And zero risk of virilization. You cannot virilize a woman with insulin. You can cause insulin resistance, and you can cause all sorts of other problems that we potentially have to mitigate. But virilization is not one of those concerns about a small amount of insulin.
I think that's a good thing, because we have different pathways, not just the androgen receptors.
Sure.
So I have a question about SARMs, because you talked now about steroidal SARMs like Tren.
Yep. Can I just, before we get into that, can I just explain what those 8 pathways are? Can you just give me a little latitude?
Yeah, of course.
So I'd just like to explain. So the 8 metabolic pathways that we can pretty much, we understand very well and we can modulate. So the first 2 that I'm going to explain are, they come with the risk of male secondary sexual characteristics in women. And that is, what we call classic genomic signaling by the androgen receptor. In other words, this is a compound that we take by mouth or by injection, that basically it's a ligand, it binds with the androgen receptor and causes, in technical terms, gene transcription, but basically, let's just say it works via the androgen receptor. That pathway is what we would classically identify as anabolic steroids. And then there's a second pathway called the non-classic genomic signaling pathway, which is, again, anabolic steroids. Those 2 pathways are really, they come with the risk of male secondary sexual characteristics in women. The other ones, which are in order, so via the estrogen receptor beta, this is a pathway we can modulate via anti-catabolic action, growth hormone, IGF-1, insulin signaling, the beta-2 androgenic receptor, myostatin inhibition, which I mentioned before, and mitochondrial quality. These are markers that, these are pathways, that we can modulate. The last 6 don't come with virilization risk. The first 2 do. So you see, my point is I'm making is, what we want to do is we want to start modulating the 6 that don't have that risk. And then when we have done all we can do, or all we're willing to do on those 6, then by all means, we transfer the conversation to the first 2. Whereas with men, it's literally the opposite. We would start with the androgen receptor and we would move down the list. Okay, you wanted to ask about, does that make sense, that list? Yeah,
that makes
Totally.
sense, because I think a lot of people that listen now will say, hey, what they are talking about, because it's really in deep.
Can I just throw that out there? Let me just express it, because this is the 800 pink gorilla, or the 800-pound pink gorilla in the room. Let's be honest, a lot of people are going to say, what the fuck did he just say? I don't understand what he said. That's fair, right? I think that's fair, right? The problem is, if I speak with too much jargon, okay, then the people that don't understand. And if I dumb it down too much, okay, it's very difficult to communicate the real issues that play here. And I try very, very hard to find the balance between those 2 things. Yeah. And it's always difficult when I'm addressing a group of people, because typically coaches go, yes, 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 yes. And then there's going to be a percentage of people listening going, what? That's fair. Yeah. It's much easier for me to communicate one-on-one with someone, because I can then tailor my language and tailor my conversation to that individual's current knowledge level. So if I'm talking to a doctor, I will talk to him like a doctor. Yeah. Mm-hmm. If I'm talking to someone that goes I don't know any of that, I will just talk in really simple terms. I'm able to do that. It's just very difficult when you're addressing a group of people. And I'm kind of somewhat talking to you as coaches.
It was very well understandable. So, but to summarize that, so we have 8 metabolic pathways.
8 pathways. 6 of them come with virilization risk, 2 do not. So we start with the 6 that don't, and then so just the last tag on from that. I have recently opened what I believe is the only website in the world specifically intended for female enhancement education called enhancedwomen.com. Unashamedly is a brand new project. I look at this saying, look, you need to view this project through the filter of where it's going to be in the next 2 years, not where it is today. It's just starting out, right? And I created the project because people just said to me, like, dude, you have to put some information out there for women. So it's a new site. I literally launched it 2 months ago, okay? And I asked people to look at it and, maybe just bookmark it, whatever like that. Yes, it is a paid membership site. I have no problem if people say, look, I'll come back in a year and see what's on offer, fine. So, yeah, we slowly building these resources, but hopefully you can go, yes, okay, there's 8 pathways. If you go to the website, you'll see the 8 pathways. Like I'll put something up there for free. People can see that that's the 8 pathways, right? At least you've got then threads you can start pulling on, saying, well, what are these pathways and how do I modulate them? And maybe even talk to your coach about them. So what can we do to affect a strategy that allows us to leverage this model? Yep.
And so now we understand we have different pathways and different PEDs that don't have a virilization effect. And now the newest generation of drugs are the non-steroidal SARMs.
Correct.
Can you explain first what are the non-steroidal
So let me
SARMs?
just start by explaining what steroidal SARMs are, and then we can go on to, because it's very important, especially for guys that understand this. So if you understand that testosterone, the molecule testosterone, was synthesized in mid 1930s. And pretty much straight away, they started modifying that molecule, trying to achieve this outcome, maintain the therapeutic benefits of testosterone, minimize the androgenic potential. And they did a pretty good job of that, to the point where we would generally say, this is very broad rule of thumb, that many of these drugs have an androgenic potential against testosterone, about 10 to 1. So if you're taking 3 milligrams of testosterone a week, you could take 30 milligrams of primobolan or 30 milligrams of anavar or 30 milligrams of masteron, and very, very, very roughly have, in relatively similar androgenic consequence, about 10 to 1. That's very loose, okay? That's fair to say that then you have to understand that none of those molecules, they successfully completely remove the androgenic impact. And so the goal of what we call SARMs, okay, the current generation of SARMs, is to basically pick up where that work left off and see if we can develop molecules that effectively maintain the anabolic potential, that is via the androceptor, but completely remove the androgenic impact, right? And that's where we will basically say, because so that's where SARMs. Now, the problem with SARMs is this, and that is today, in 2021, it may, no single SARMs in the world has been approved for human use. They're very much in the class of what we would call research chemicals. Secondly, you have to understand that there are many different classes of SARMs, and they all have different chemical structural models, many different structural models. So all testosterone derivatives, all anabolic steroids fundamentally have the testosterone molecule, and they're derived from that. SARMs are basically disparate classes of chemical drugs that have different skeletal structures, and so they work in very different ways. And so you have to look at, you can't cluster everything together in SARMs and say, well, SARMs are. You can't say anything about SARMs are. You have to pull the individual drug out and have a discussion about that drug, and then put it back and pull the next one out. So there is a class of drugs I think that women should absolutely invest time into understanding, and that is a drug called ostarine. Okay. Ostarine has been through more human clinical trials than any other SARMs that we have. It looks very promising. I fully support women looking at SARMs as an enhancement product, okay? There are other SARMs, however, that are so poorly understood that we don't even have any human clinical trial data on them, okay? An example would be, there's a SARM called RAD 140, most people might have heard of it. There is a single human use study, one study so far to look at. That's all we've got, okay? It's in women with breast cancer, and they have a number of different dosages, and we have some preliminary data, but even the study has not been published yet. So nobody's got a chance to read it yet. So there's a study that's been done. We're still waiting on an opportunity to read it. Now, would I consider that a drug that has been had one human clinical trial done, and some rodent studies and some primate studies, and we haven't published the study, to be what I would call a safe to use drug? I would not. I would consider that a research chemical that has to be placed into a Well, it's very interesting, and I'm happy to talk about it all day, but you have to classify that as we don't really know what the consequence of long-term use is. All we have so far is crazy buggers that have been sticking it down their throat for the last 10 years, fingers crossed and hoping for the best. So what I would say is the future of enhancement products for women absolutely, unequivocally includes a SARMs product. No question of it. It's my gut feeling, though, that it won't be any of the SARMs that are currently on the market. It will be something new that comes forth where they go, wow, we finally found what we were looking for. Because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to find a drug to effectively replace things like Anavar for women. Okay. And they're looking, and it's quite promising, but if we're really honest, they haven't found it yet. Okay. So do I think they'll find it? There's no doubt they're going to find it. I'm just simply saying, just don't fool yourself that they've found it yet. Okay. So if we look at these drugs, I would say I would place that drug, basically Ostarine, on the list of things that we should talk about. There are some problems with SARMs, though, in terms of virilization impact, but most people don't realize, but it's not via direct effect. So if you take a drug like Anavar, really what we're concerned about is the implications of Anavar binding with the androgen receptor and causing gene transcription and the androgenic impact of that. But what is not well understood, some of the drugs like Winstrol, for example, some women are very sensitive to Winstrol, and they seem to have a response to androgen that is like an outlier effect. You kind of go, it's really weird. She's really sensitive to that drug. And typically what that is it's actually not Winstrol. It's Winstrol causing a suppression of sex hormone binding globulin, and consequential to that action, free testosterone levels raise up. And it's the free testosterone levels that are causing the androgenic consequence. Now that pathway...
Sorry, is Victor, just a question. I read that Winstrol has an effect on progesterone too. Is this true?
I think it's fair to say that all anabolic steroids, to some degree, okay, are going to bind with other receptor classes. Okay, so you can't really say any particular drug only binds with the androgen receptor and that's all it does. Mm-hmm. An example, so Trenbolone, one of the reasons that Trenbolone works so very well is really not through its action on the androgen receptor, but its action basically through what we call anti-catabolic action via the glucocorticosteroid receptor. Okay, so does it have a potential to cause elevations of prolactin and progesterone? Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you, but you can't really pull Winstrol out and say, I heard about that. You have to say, I heard that steroids can do this. Is that true? Yes, it's true. And each of the different derivatives has the potential to not only cause a different effect on different receptors, but also on an intra-individual genetic basis. So in other words, if you gave that same drug to 10 women, you could see, there'll be a cluster of very similar outcomes. And then typically you would see one or two outliers to that effect. Like there's a bell curve, yeah? So one of the problems with SARMs, just going back to SARMs, is SARMs have the potential to induce what I call secondary androgenic consequence, okay? So it's not through their direct action, it's through binding, it's through the suppression of sex hormone binding globulin that effectively raises free testosterone levels, and it's the increase in free testosterone levels that can potentially have an effect. Now that's not true of all women. It's conditional, and so this is one of the challenges when we're looking at drugs that are not really what we would call well-researched in humans. They're not in clinical use. We don't have 30 years of clinical data to reflect on. We have, a smaller number of studies, even though I would say Ostarine is certainly a drug candidate for women. I have women using Ostarine, and I would prefer women use Ostarine over Anavar, right?
But not at a dosage of normally in the UGL. You see 10 milligrams a tablet, and that's too much, I think.
So if you look at the clinical trials, we see effect in this drug at 3 to 5 milligrams a day. I don't have a problem with women using 3 to 5 milligrams a day. I would say that's preferential to someone using 20 milligrams of Anavar a day. But all of these discussions have to be conditional. You understand? Like if people want blanket statements, they can grab onto and say that's safe, that's not safe. I would say, look, if you're looking for a drug that completely removes the virilization component here, you just have to stay away from anything that is in that class of drugs. Yeah. And if you're prepared to accept some risk, then you start with the lowest risk drug and move your way up. I would say Ostarine is currently the lowest risk drug. Yeah, but it's not risk-free. You know what I mean? And this is what I said. We have to be very careful with the wording we choose. I use the word safer use design. I use the word safer use. You never hear me walking around saying it's safe, it's safe, it's safe, right? I could very easily make an argument that you're going to have to explain to me what the risk model is with 1 unit of recombinant human growth hormone a day with women. But I can tell you what the problem is. Today, most people are purchasing growth hormone through UGLs, okay? And how do you know it's growth hormone? How do you know it's pure? You could very easily get an infection. You could very easily create antibody issues by introducing things that you shouldn't be introducing in your body because it's not what it says on the label. Even that's a risk. You know what I mean? Not many people are using purely pharmaceutical grade products in our tribe.
So you're saying there's always a risk, no matter if it's where it comes from, how you administer it, are there long-term studies, especially with SARMs, so there's always a risk.
I think it's disingenuous and dishonest to say to people there is a way to do this without risk. I like to use the analogy. I mean, some people like analogies, some people don't. I'll just throw one on the table. I ride a motorcycle. I like riding motorcycle, you know, and I very rarely ride my motorcycle at the speed limit. Right? So if the speed limit says 80 kilometers an hour, you'll often see me go past at 90. Now, if I'm honest, that raises my risk profile, by some margin, but I would argue the elevation of risk is relatively moderate given the fact that I know what I'm doing and I'm a very good rider. And I've been riding since I was 15 years old. But it's disingenuous to say there's no risk in that. Just the sheer virtue of the fact that I'm moving faster than the flow of traffic, right, has to add some measure of risk. Now, what I would say is every 10-kilometer increment that I increase that speed, my risk gets more and more and more and more until I get to the point where I go, man, that's high risk. Now you're traveling at 160 kilometers an hour in an 80 zone, and it's just a matter of time.
But I would be interested in how do you measure or classify the risk that there are no long-term studies about SARMs compared to other risks that the drug has anyways?
You have faith. That's the reality. You have faith. So this is one of the reasons that I would say to someone, look, the safest possible model there is one, only use approved for human use drugs that our tribe has been using for 50 years, and we have very good clinical data and observational evidence to support. And the moment you step outside of currently approved for human use drugs, and the moment you step outside of, what I would call even drugs that are going to get, in my opinion, it's just a matter of time before Ostarine is approved. It's very, very close. Yep. But it's still fair to say, but we don't have lots of long-term clinical data studies in it because it's yet to be approved, right? But you also have to understand we are in a tribe where people use all manner of veterinary products and all manner of sort of drugs that are not for human use anyway. I mean, people use, I'm sure you're familiar with the drug Boldenone. You might have heard of equipoise. It's quite common in male use. This drug has never been approved for human use. It's effectively used in the equine practice or in horses. So why are we injecting ourselves with that? The first thing you can do is go, well, I'll eliminate all not approved for human use drugs from the table. Just take them off the table. This is, a discussion you would have about, so how do we get to the lowest possible risk? Yep.
I have some questions about the fat burners, but before we dive into the fat burners, I now testing berberine for some clients during the off season and during the cut. I read some papers, meta-analysis, and it seems like berberine has more than just the effect of stabilizing blood glucose levels. But what is your general opinion on berberine? How to take it, and is it effective? For what reason?
Yeah, I think you need to view berberine through the eyes of what I would call an insulin sensitizer. It's very fair to say that most drugs, actually, if you dig a little deeper, you go, holy crap, that drug does a lot more than I thought it does. Do you know what I mean? So even if you take something simple like testosterone, you understand we view testosterone through the eyes of being an agent of protein accretion. We take the drug, we get hypertrophic response. But I'm sure you understand that it has many functions on cognitive capacity. Like, without testosterone, we die, basically. You understand? It's not just about getting jacked, yeah? So I think it's fair to say that that class of drug, you would put a couple of drugs on the table there together for a clustered conversation, which would include metformin and berberine. Now, these are drugs that work through different mechanical actions, but they have somewhat similar outcomes. And people tend to choose them based on where they live in the world. I, for example, live in Thailand. I can walk into my local pharmacy and I can purchase metformin, pharmaceutical grade metformin for $3 for a box of, 100 tablets or something like that. Berberine, however, I have to import into the country. Why would I use berberine? Like, I'm just going to use metformin. It's cheap, it's pharmaceutical quality, and it fundamentally does somewhat similar things. Now, there are many, many potential benefits from that. It's an anti-cancer agent. It's a cognitive function agent. It's an insulin, sensitizing agent. It does many things, but we would typically in our tribe tend to tighten the filter and look through like a specific window of what it does for us. And that would be an improvement in insulin sensitivity. And the consequential improvement in insulin sensitivity means that we would potentially see the way that we store body fat and what we do with caloric intake in an improved fashion. But it's a very fair conversation. Go, yeah, but that's not the whole story, Victor. I completely agree. There's a list of things that potentially drugs like metformin do that you can get into. Now, the challenge is for me is I'm not sure that we have enough evidence to say the dosages that we should be using that we're going to see that clinical effect. An example, there are a number of studies that look at insulin sensitizers in an anti-aging capacity, but all of those studies done at dosages that far exceed what I use. So it's not unrealistic to say maybe that data doesn't really apply to me because I'm not using that much. I'll give you a simple example. There's a very famous study that says they gave elderly individuals 1,700 milligrams of metformin a day. They undertook resistance training, and they said, well, the metformin blunted hypertrophic response. I don't know whether you're familiar with that study, yeah? And a lot of people say, you shouldn't take metformin, look at this study. And the reality is this: if you're 70 years old, okay, and you eat 60 grams of protein a day, and you take 1,700 milligrams of metformin a day, you can expect two things. Your testosterone levels will be lowered, and your insulin levels be lowered, and consequential to your insulin levels being lowered, growth factors associated with insulin would be lowered, and you would expect a blunting of hypertrophic response. Okay. Now, I am not that old. I use anabolic steroids and other growth promotion agents. I certainly don't eat that much protein a day. So the idea of 500 milligrams of metformin that I take, blunting hypertrophic response, is ludicrous. So the challenge with these drugs is, do the negative consequences and do the potential therapeutic practices happen at the dosages that we're taking in our cohort? It's very difficult to say. So you have to be very careful when you look at things like metformin and say, there's a list of things that it might do, but I'm not sure that we're taking that dose. Yeah. And I would argue someone that's interested in berberine or metformin, you start at the same milligrams per drug. It's 500 milligrams a day starting dose. And one would expect to see in an otherwise healthy individual some improvement in insulin response. Some. I'm not sure that you could go, well, that's an anti-cancer agent and that's an anti-aging agent and that's a cognitive function. I'm not sure that that's going to be prostate protective, and I'm not sure it's going to do this. But I also don't think it's going to blunt hypertrophic response either. So I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but how much you take and what you're seeking from it is very variable on who you are and what you're seeking from that outcome.
I saw the studies about berberine that talked about microbiome diversity.
Sure.
That it improves that, and it's really interesting for the health.
So the question would be, do you have a problem? What problem? Sometimes it's like, okay, here's the solution. I'm looking for a problem. do you know what I'm saying? So yes. I would argue there's a segment of the community out there that have this problem. Do you? And then, well, how much did they give them? I'm not sure whether you can recall the dosages in that studies, but typically those types of clinical studies are not using 500 milligrams a day. They're kind of using the upper limits of it. So in other words, if you start taking the upper limits, you can expect this benefit with this hand, and maybe what's the consequence of that? Is there any downside to that? As a natural individual, you can expect potentially a reduction in androgen production and a blunting of insulin production and a consequential lowering of IGF-1 levels. And you might not want to do that. Now, if
they use something like 100 milligrams per kilogram.
And this is the point. That's an awful lot. So at 100 milligrams, Sorry, at 100 and like I'm about 110 kilograms. That's an awful lot of metformin a day. Like I'm not going to take that much.
No, I talk about berberine in the
studies. But the point I'm making is those two drugs can be viewed through somewhat similar filters. They don't have the exact same mechanism of action, but very often they have somewhat similar outcomes, and that is a shared outcome for both of those drugs. Yep. So I guess I would say this is where we have to be very careful when we talk about drugs. It's very easy to get excited about things and grasp onto things, and and you're going, yeah, but I'm not sure that what you're saying is in reality supportable through clinical evidence, because you're not using that much and you don't have that problem to begin with. You follow what I'm saying?
In the past, I have some observation because I'm a trainer for 14 years now, and I talk with other coaches and see what they tell me, what they do with their clients. And sometimes you don't have good evidence, but you see some trends. So for example, some years ago, I started introducing intra-workout nutrition, some EAAs and some cluster dextrin. But I didn't know that we have a little bit of studies about this. But I saw in the practice with my observations, okay, they improve their performance, they recover better. And the same thing is through my mind right now with berberine. So I'm just experimenting with my clients.
I would say there is a cohort of individuals within our tribe, okay, that you can apply that framework to very well, okay? One of the challenges with our tribe is I think nutritional practice is very poor within our tribe. We have very repetitive diets. We don't have diversity of food. We have a tremendous amount of gastrointestinal issues in our community. I don't know whether you're aware of that, but a lot. And so sometimes people are looking for solutions like that. I've heard people going, will this help me? I'm going, yeah, but you just fix your diet. Like, why are you turning to pharmacology to fix a problem that's self-induced through poor behaviors in the first place? So I wouldn't dismiss these things, but what I would argue is, in my opinion, at least, most people should be looking at these tools as effectively insulin sensitizers. That's what they do very well at the type of dosages that we're using. So if you notice that, through lifestyle, through behaviors, even through pharmacology, that you have elevated, levels of glucose response, you understand the premise that as insulin sensitivity rises, as insulin resistance rises, our capacity to basically store nutrients becomes impaired. This is very common in our tribe. Fixing that problem with that class of drugs, it makes sense and it works anecdotally and observationally. And I completely support that. Now, if someone wants to start pulling on threads outside of that and saying, well, I use it for that, but I feel I get beneficial effect at this dose on these other things, right, that's fabulous. There's a lot of drugs that I take. I'll give you an example. I take a drug called telmisartan, which is, the trade name is Makardis. And I believe that any man that's using androgens, at supraphysiological doses, should be using an ARB to suppress angiotensin II, which is the effector molecule of the RAS system, which is responsible for things like left ventricular hypertrophy and stuff like that. Now, if you understand what telmisartan does, it's kidney protective, it's cognitive protective, it's a potential Alzheimer's drug candidate, it's this, it's good for hair loss, it protects your prostate, but I take it to protect my heart and my kidneys. And it may well have a list of another 25 things it does, and I hope it does, but I would take it regardless of whether that was the outcome or not, because I know what I'm taking it for, it's effective.
I know you don't like Cardarine so much because it's not so good like telmisartan. I tried it, Cardarine, and it improves my blood lipids level.
Yep.
But there are some problems. Maybe you can clarify the problems with Cardarine.
It's not that I don't like Cardarine. I think it's a fabulous drug. It's very unfortunate that it wasn't able to pass the standardized toxicology testings that all drugs are required to. So before a drug reaches market, you have to give this drug at ridiculously high doses to basically rats and mice for 2 years to see whether we see carcinogenic consequence. Drugs like Anavar have been through that test and passed. Drugs like telmisartan have been through that test and passed. When they gave rats and mice that drug, GW1516, to rats and mice for 2 years, every single dose they tested produced cancerous outcome. Every single dose. Now, if that was the only test done, you go, maybe, but then you start digging further and you go, that wasn't the only test that were done. There's about 10 tests on rats and mice, and they all produce the cancerous effect. And at the end of the day, GlaxoSmithKline, who are the developers behind the drug, put their hands up in there and walked away from the drug because they realized they could never get through FDA approval testing with that track record. And when you look at it, you kind of go, so here's two drugs, GW1516 and Metabolic, who fundamentally do the same thing. They are PPAR agonists, yeah? So we could expect, what would we expect from that? Well, an improvement in insulin response, an improvement in HDL cholesterol levels, an improvement in lipid stabilization, sorts of things. If you said to me which one works better, I would say no question about which one works better. GW1561 works better, right? But I have concerns over safety when a drug is unable to pass standardized toxicology testing to the point where the developer just walks away from it, and the other drug got through the testing and has been in the market for 25 years, being, you know, effectively clean. To me, this is a no-brainer. The only reason you would ever choose a drug that hasn't been approved for human use is fundamentally this. You're seeking an outcome that is not on offer from the current incumbent drugs. Does that make sense? So the reason a drug displaces a current drug is it effectively does the job better with a better safety profile. That's why one drug displaces another, okay? Now, if a drug can't have a better safety profile, it doesn't do it better. So GW1516, in my opinion, did the job better, but it failed on the safety profile. So you have to make a choice.
How high was the amount in the rat studies?
Okay, so you have to understand that there's something called a human equivalent dose. So in other words, what they give to mice and rats has to be then calculated back to human use. Okay, so the dose that they gave them, you could approximate it to, and people are gonna, I'm not careful here. They gave them graded doses, so they gave them this much, this much, this much, this much, and this was saying every single dose they gave them failed, right? The lowest dose they gave them would equate in human terms to about 40 milligrams a day.
Okay.
Which is not too far away from the use. Now, the interesting thing, when you look at the human clinical use studies, what we found was that you get, you know, pretty much the same outcome from 5 milligrams a day, from 10 milligrams a day, and 20 milligrams a day in lipid stabilization. So if someone said to me, how would I use cardarine? I would say under this curve, if someone came to me and they had very poor lipid profile, and they said, look, I need to fix this. What's the most effective way to do that? I would say, well, very low dose cardarine is going to be the fastest way. But if you're using telmisartan as a baseline drug anyway, you've got that in play. Does that make sense? So it's kind of really tricky because I use, you know, because I use Metabolic every day by default, baseline position, I don't have a purpose for another drug that is effectively competitive, because that means I would stop using this drug to introduce this drug. You would never put them in the table at the same time. Okay. So the only person that would potentially be interested in GW would be someone that's not currently using telmisartan. And I only have one question: why the hell not? Because that's
maybe
one of the things
to get it is sometimes difficult.
I completely agree with that. I'm very empathetic to the fact that I have the great privilege and the great luxury of living in a country where I can walk into my local pharmacy and I know more than my pharmacist, and he asks me all the time, what the hell are you doing? The luxury about it, have the knowledge and get access to these things. I can snap my fingers and say, take this and take that. And I completely agree with that. The great challenge, of course, is there is one discussion around what we should be doing, and then that discussion becomes potentially marred by what we might be impaired by doing, by where we live in the world or circumstances. That doesn't make it right. It just means, well, I'm right and you need to figure it out. Do you know what I mean? And if you can't figure it out, you should use an option. An example would be, if you can't access telmisartan, there are 8 ARBs in total. That's just one of them. Maybe you can get your hands on one of the other ones. If you can't get that, let's talk about an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor, like an ACE inhibitor, like ramipril or something like that. In other words, I'm sure we can find something somewhere that we can put on the table, like this idea of, I cannot get my hands on an angiotensin receptor blocker. I cannot get my hands on an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor. Not trying very hard. I'm sorry. You're just not trying very hard. If you can't find anything to put on the table, yes, I agree. It may be difficult or may be price prohibitive, but let's face it, this is not, you know, a sport that you should be involved in on the finest of budget. This is a rich man's luxury sport. You know, the amount of money that I spend, I tell people, I spend $1,000 a month on this hobby, and people go, "Oh my God, like on what?" You have to understand, the singly largest bill I have is food. You mean I spend $1,000 a year just on blood work. So you should be getting blood work every 12 weeks, and it's going to cost you a little more than $200 every time you get blood work. That's $1,000 a year.
So do you make a difference between enhanced and not enhanced?
So what I would argue is it depends whether you're competing or not.
Let's say for competitor, for athletes.
Yeah, no, I would say if you're an elite natural competitor, you should be getting regular pathology work done. Okay. If you're a recreational trainer in your natural, I think it's a massive overkill. Once a year is plenty. Do you mean? I think you're well served by, having an annual checkup with your doctor. So like I'll give an example. As an enhanced male that's over 100 kilos, I take my blood pressure and blood glucose, fasted blood glucose every week. I don't think what group of individuals falls into that category? Doctors would call me a hypochondriac if I wasn't doing what I'm doing. I probably, and this is, a great conversation about risk. Sometimes people ask me, do you think there's risk there? I would argue for someone like myself who started knowing nothing, right? And educated myself to the point where I now teach doctors what they need to know to help their patients, right? And I get pathology work every 12 weeks. I get an echocardiogram done every year. I get this and this and this and this. I'm probably better prepared for things coming down the line than almost anyone else that I know, at least in my circle. So my risk is elevated, agreed. But my preparedness to deal with situation has been massively turned up as well. I feel the two tend to balance each other out. I don't know people that get an echocardiogram every year. They tend to get it like, if you ask the average person, if you ask your dad, when was the last time, what's that? You know what I'm saying? So blood work is something you get when you're sick, right? I see it as a preventative measure. So it's this interesting paradigm between, I think it's disingenuous to say that my risk profile is not elevated by my behaviors, but the prophylactic or the mitigation process I put in place, I feel balances that nicely.
We work a lot with our athletes and clients with blood work, because it doesn't matter if they are enhanced or not, because what we see oftentimes they have problems, but we can't identify what the problem is. And then let's say the estrogen is low or the progesterone is low, and you see, okay, maybe they have some stress factors, and then you can regulate it with lifestyle factors, with sleep, with some supplements.
That's a very good point. Let me just make a bolt-on point to that though. With female use of enhancement, okay, it is completely plausible that you could send someone off to get blood work and they come back with perfect blood work, perfect, right? But they're not at no risk. Why? Firstly, you cannot measure anabolic steroids in serum. Okay. So when you take Anavar, there's consequence that you don't see in blood work. Yes, you see lipid skewing. Yes, you see potential this and this and this and this. But let's say they manage to mitigate all of those through correct behavior. That doesn't mean a woman that gets perfect blood work is not at risk of virilization. And this is where I circle back to the original conversation. There are women in the transgender community that have perfect bill of health, and yet they're gradually turning into men. The doctors are not sitting there saying you're damaging your kidneys, you're damaging your heart, you're damaging your vascular system. They're not saying that, saying thumbs up, everything looks great, but man, you look more like a dude every day. So you have to be very careful when you look at blood work with enhanced women athletes, that women don't fall into this trap of thinking if my blood work is good, then I'm not at risk of exposure here. They are not the same thing. With men, for the most part, they are. A man that gets an echocardiogram, a calcium score, pathology work every 12 weeks, measures his blood pressure, measures his blood glucose. For the most part, you can go, keep going, thumbs up, but you cannot do that with a woman, because that consequence that we're chasing is not reflected in pathology work. It's not reflected in imaging work. It's something that's happening at such a level that you cannot see it through those markers.
So it's impossible to see the side effects.
It's not only impossible, the reason I'm so passionate about this is the two side effects that present with women first are either unwanted hair growth, or changes to the voice. Now, The worst one is changes to the voice. Why? Because when men and women are born, or when they're young, before prepubescent, let's say that, right? The voice architecture is identical. They're not different. But as we expose men to androgens over the puberty period, we actually see a changing of the architecture of the voice box. And once that occurs, you cannot turn it back, right?
Yes,
Again,
but
go ahead, sorry.
The voice or the hair, you will see it. So it's visual.
Yes, but the difference is that once it's happened, you can't turn it back. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, you know, oh my God, what's happened to my voice? That's your voice for the rest of your life, darling.
Yes. Yeah. But Anavar has, for example, also a side effect on the liver.
No, I would say, again, this is one of the interesting things they're saying about women. So the doses that women use of these growth promoters typically are so small, right, that the potential negative effect on organ health is non-existent.
Okay.
A woman taking 10 milligrams of Anavar a day is not going to be seeing recognizable liver stress, right? Nor kidney stress, nor cardiovascular distress, nothing. But if you leave her on that long enough, her voice will change.
Yeah.
Now, it is fair to say that there's a dose-dependent response here. So if you raise the dose and raise the dose and raise the dose, that yes, eventually you start to, create organ stress. But typically women that are using 10, 15, 20 milligrams a day, this is the clinical dose. You could use 20 milligrams a day of Anavar, and what you would expect to see would be, okay, so for women, really, I would put at the top of the list lipid skewing. You'd see a suppression of HDL cholesterol carriers, probably an elevation of LDL carriers. That's the big one. That's the big one. You're not really going to see liver stress. You're not going to see renal stress through health marker work. You're not going to see increases in. I mean, eventually you could plausibly see increases in coronary plaque volumes and things like that, consequential to the HDL suppression. But far, far, far earlier than that, her voice will change.
And I have a question to that drug. So for me, it was never really clear, are those side effects reversible or are they irreversible? Because sometimes you hear you only have them when you take them, but they will come back. So your voice will, I don't know, like you say, your voice will go back to the normal level, or so it's completely irreversible.
Yeah, the best way I could describe this is if you, again, I mean, people are uncomfortable. I think these things are fascinating, though. If you look at the transgender community, so you understand there's completely the opposite. There are men that were born as men that want to be identified as women. And one of the things they would like more than anything else is to not sound like a dude. Do you know? So we have a tremendous amount of research effort that's gone into trying to help men, unmasculinize their voice. Do you know? And the reality is no amount of anti-estrogens, no amount of estrogens, no amount of anti-androgens can change a virilized voice box. Once it's done, the only option is surgery. Okay. Now, what's fair to say is if you interrupt it partway through that process, you may well be able to get a handle on it. So it's like saying, if I got a boy who was 11 years old and he got to 12 years old and he was partway through puberty and we castrated him, right? So he no longer saw any androgens. Is it plausible that the changes that we started seeing to his voice box were attenuated and went backwards? Yes, that's completely plausible because the process had not completed itself yet, right? But once he gets to, say, 16 years old, if you castrate him, he still sounds the same. You understand what I'm saying? So there's no way to take a man that was born as a man, right, and give him some type of drugs or remove androgens or, raise estrogens to make him sound like a woman. Once he sounds like a man, once his voice box has undergone that anatomical change, it's permanent. What you're asking is, if I'm partway through the process and the process is interrupted, is there a chance there that I can wind that back? And I would say, yeah, I don't really have a problem with that. To what magnitude is the question? But if we're honest, and I know this is very confronting, but sometimes I say things that are uncomfortable. If you go to your local bodybuilding show at a national level, and you look at all the girls who are in the bikini ranks, you think, what the hell is Victor talking about? These girls look fabulous. Do you know? Now, wait until the Masters women's turn up. And you look at them, and I'm just being honest with you, they all have been touched by this stick. It's just a question of by what degree. You never see someone who started this at 20 and is doing it at 40 that is untouched. You just don't see that person. If you see a masters female athlete that's untouched and you talk to her, you pull aside, you go, yeah, I started 3 years ago. You're in. Most women who've been at this for 20 years, it's just, the question is not, was she touched? It was to what degree? Yeah. So that's cold, that's harsh, but I invite anyone to do it. I've done it many, many times. Every time I go show, I go and look at the women, and the young girls look fabulous. And the masters class, they'll go, that's the consequence of years and years of exposure to androgens. They all have a little bit of voice. They all have a little bit of, and some of them at the extreme end, you go like, man, wow, wow. Dude. So that's
if you take,
cool.
if you would say, if you want to take some androgens as woman to enhance your performance and your look, for example, as an athlete, as bikini or wellness athlete, you should consider to take it just in a really small time frame, right?
I would say, going back to that thing again, the first thing is you need to sit down with the individual. I don't like making blanket statements. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Understand who they are, where they've come from, where they're going. What are they powerlifters? Are they physique athletes? Are they going to retire in a year? Are they going to do this for life? This is my life. I've been doing this 27 years. If I was a woman, I'm telling you, how the hell would I get away with it? It's not possible. I'm going to get touched by it. Now, the truth is, most people that do bodybuilding shows maybe do 2 or 3 shows. That's it for the life. So if you looked at that person, it's completely plausible that you could say there's a woman that comes along, because everyone goes, there's an exception to the rule. There's always, here's the exception rule. Someone comes along and does 2 bodybuilding shows and takes a cycle here and a cycle there. I would make the argument that it's very, very likely that they probably get away with minimal impact. All right. My message is for the people that love the sport and that are going to be here for the next 10 years. You're in plus. That's who I'm addressing. In my honest opinion, I'm not sure why you're messing around with anabolic steroids and performance enhancement if you're not here for life. This is a lifetime commitment to me. You're in. You should do natural bodybuilding if you just want to do a couple of shows. You're in. There's natural federations for naturals, and you should enjoy that. I trained for 20 years as a natural before I opened that box. You're in. And what I'm saying to people is, if you open that box, you have to, before you start making cycle designs, you have to say, so where have you come from? Where are you going? What are your goals? Is this serious, recreational, aspiring, professional, powerlifter, bodybuilder, strongman, endurance athlete? All, I coach people in the fight game. All of these needs are different, and they're fulfilled through different strategic models. But as a general rule of thumb, yes, you would say, look, if there's 365 days in a year, right? Some exposure to androgens is tolerable and manageable. The first thing we need to do, though, is try to keep that duration of exposure to the shortest possible window of exposure. I would argue that for many, many women, you could probably, if you tried really hard, keep that down to, say, 60 days, 8 weeks, right? But the question begs, well, what am I going to do for the other 8 months of the year? So if you said to me, right, for the other 8 months of the year, I'm going to do this, and for those 4 months, I'm going to do that, the problem is solved. The challenge, what we're trying to address here, is if you do that for 8 weeks and take 8 weeks off and do 8 weeks and do 8 weeks off and 8 weeks and do 8 weeks off, I'm telling you, it's just a matter of time before you start to experience these consequences. You can't keep these androgens in and in and in and in year after year after year and think you're going to walk away being unscathed. And I don't know anyone who's enhanced that actually wants to be enhanced for 8 weeks of the year. People, it's if we're really honest with you, it can be very addictive to feel that way. You feel like Superman, right? And you always want to go back. And what I'm offering is a methodology where you can go back. You just have to say, look, I just need to take that one class of drugs and put it front of mind to say, those things cause virilization. I'm going to use those strategically on a short-term exposure basis. And these things they certainly come with a list of problems we need to understand and educate ourselves on, but they're things like insulin resistance, potential hyperglycemic risk, and we'll use those for most of the year, and we'll use these strategically. So at the end of 5 years, if you've had a total lifetime cumulative exposure of 8 weeks by 5, right, you're going to be in a much better position to have been lightly touched, if at all, versus the woman that's on and off and on and off and on and off every 8 weeks. This is like Perfect, two profoundly different pathways to me. Yeah.
Thank you, Victor.
The downside to that, just try and close the conversation off a little bit.
Yes.
The downside to that is this. If someone cannot explain the good, the bad, and the ugly of something, they don't know, you should be very careful listening to them. So let me be very clear. The downside to this model is Anavar is relatively inexpensive, relatively easy to source, and relatively to take. The learning curve is like what? Right? This model requires more moving parts, which means more to learn, and it's without question more expensive. Okay? So in other words, we have two profoundly different models. This is cheap and easy to execute, but comes with this risk. This is holy crap. Like, man, I need to roll up my sleeves and I need to learn more about this. And this one's saying, I'm not proposing for a moment that the woman that wants to do a single show and then retire and never touch it again needs to come over here and invest all these hundreds of hours into learning this. You just need to find a good coach that knows what he's doing to help you do that. But if you're going to be doing this for the next 10 years, you should roll up your sleeves and educate yourself a little bit so you can listen to people and go, man, that guy's talking shit. I know more than he does. Do you know what I mean? So depending on who you are, where you've been and where you're going, determines the investment that you need to make into understanding this. And I would encourage everybody to say, right, if I'm just passing through, let me just do some due diligence and get a female-friendly coach. They're out there. Okay. And if I'm going to live here, or even more importantly, this is what Prep Coach Academy is, if I have the audacity to educate others, right, I better know what I'm fucking doing here. Do you know what I mean? Like, I when I open my mouth, I'm going to be very, very careful that what comes out is supported through, clinical evidence and observation and experience. And anyone that doesn't understand the things that I've been saying, you're kind of going like, holy crap, that just makes a lot of sense. Like, you're right. Like, we have studies on women where we've given them 2 milligrams of Winstrol for 46 weeks, and half of them reported virilization consequence. It wasn't the dose, it was the duration of exposure. There was women given 3 times as much Winstrol, but they were only given to 5 weeks, and the percentage of people that reported virilization was very small by comparison. It's not just about the amount that you take, it's about the lifetime cumulative exposure to androgens that we need to keep bringing women back to this discussion about. So
thank you, Victor. We appreciate a lot that you was here on our podcast, and your knowledge is incredible. I think I can speak for all the other people that we could listen to you all the day, because there's so much to say. Maybe if you want, in some months, we can repeat another podcast episode, maybe talking about more generally about maybe the health aspects, and maybe about demands, and maybe how to take, what supplement to take. And there are other discussions that involves this.
I'm happy to talk about anything at any time. I guess one of the things that I might suggest to you, if you're interested, because you have an audience, is it might be something that your audience would benefit from opening up like a question dialogue. Give people a chance to ask questions. And I don't know how you feel about it, but maybe we can even do a live session where people can come in and ask their questions. And I'm very interested in trying to understand what people want to know. Because it's all well and good for me to sit up here and pontificate and say this and this and this, but if I'm not answering the questions that people want to ask, then I feel like I'm not really providing the best value I can. So some type of feedback from people saying, what about this and what about this? We're down in the trenches here. We're trying to find this information and we can't seem to find this. This would be, I think, of value. And of course, the fact that you have an audience and you have a channel allows me to reach people that I don't reach in my daily communication. So.
Yeah. But thank you so much, because also for me, it was, now I have a big picture about the whole topic in a better way. I have some doors opened in my mind about this topic, and it helped a lot to understand how to approach this topic in men and women, and also drive the difference so dramatically between the two. Yeah.
Great.
So
awesome.
We have to repeat this.
I feel guilty, Nicole, because you'd asked too many questions. I think I was talking too much. Cool.
But maybe
We've gone
you
through
can,
all the questions. Yeah.
Awesome. Very good.
maybe you can summarize for our listeners, where can we find you? How can we support the literacy that is behind this topic that you try to bring to the right people? So
Thank you. Yeah. I guess right above my head there's an @ sign @ Victor Black Masterclass. So I run 3 different websites. So I have a website for men that is very much what I would call guys like us do things like this. It's not really designed to be too far down the rabbit hole. It's practical, real world, everyday advice for guys who are, you know, interested in enhancement practice. As I mentioned partway through the call, a couple of months ago, I opened what I would call a sister site for that called enhancedwomen.com. Yeah. And it's really intended to be the same thing. It's like women like us do things like this. Yeah. And then on the 1st of June, 2021, which is, you know, a couple of weeks from now, I'm going to be opening what I think is going to change the industry, which is a site specifically intended to help with the education of coaches. So the difference between them is how far we get into this. It's my opinion that most people don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole. Even some of the things we talked about today are going to be going like, I don't understand what he even said, right? I would encourage people that feel that way to simply say, right, I clearly know that I don't know what I'm talking about. I need to hire someone that does. I think that's fair. You know, but my great passion moving forward is really this Prep Coach Academy, because I feel like it can make the biggest impact on the world by teaching coaches what they need to know, and then they can in turn filter that information out to their communities. Yeah. So that's a resource that if you're a coach, if you're someone that's advising other people, it's not yet open. It's going to open like a beta launch in June, and then probably, you know, July will open the doors fully. And the whole purpose is to go as far down the rabbit hole as you guys want. So we'll be having live webinars and question and answers. So I will get on and people say, right, I've got a client. This was their blood work. What would you do? You're in. I'm going to have calls with clients where I have coaching calls where the client's going to be on the call and you will be as well listening to what we're talking about. So you'll be able to hear, okay, so I'm having this problem. You know, I've got gynecomastia. I'm having sexual dysfunction issues. I've got acne, you know, this and this and this is happening. And I'm going to help the client. Obviously, they'll be pixelated out so you can't see who they are. But it's almost like, and that's a weird thing, but you know, if you've ever watched a television hospital show where you have intern doctors and they follow the other doctors around on their calls, basically, you know, looking at the patients and making their own diagnosis, you know, in the presence of a doctor. I'm trying to make it as much of a hands-on educational experience as I possibly can. And I think in 2021 we have the educational tools like Zoom and webinars and things like that to make a real crack of this that we couldn't 20 years ago. It was a book, basically, you know. So that's coming. So anyone that's interested in getting in touch with me, just go to Instagram, type in Victor Black Masterclass, and you'll figure it out from there.
We will put in the description all the links.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, cool.
I'm in your member site too, and I can just recommend it. It's really good. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's good value for money. Just to let people know if they're interested. So access to the membership site is $15 a month. I've tried to make it affordable enough that everybody can afford to. If they're interested, then you can join for a couple of months, and if there's value there, you can stay. I think most people that join would say yes, I got value from that experience. So let me just say thank you for the opportunity to come on. I know I'm very passionate, and I talk a lot. I hope I didn't speak too quickly, and I hope I didn't overwhelm anyone with a monologue here, but I very much appreciate the opportunity to come and share with the community. And thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
We wish you a great day.